The room had already decided who mattered. That was the problem. It was a private event, invite-only, expensive, designed to feel exclusive without admitting it. A long table sat near the front of the venue, reserved for speakers and honored guests. Name cards placed carefully, glasses already poured, everything arranged to avoid confusion, everything except people. Anthony Hopkins arrived without ceremony. No announcement. No expectation that anyone should move or fuss. He greeted the host quietly, nodded to a few familiar faces, and took the seat assigned to him near the center of the table. He didn't check the name card. He never did. He simply sat, folded his hands, and listened. Conversation moved around him, industry talk, funding, influence disguised as philanthropy. Hopkins didn't interrupt. He rarely did. Silence was never something he rushed to fill. That silence was mistaken for availability. Across the room, an unfamiliar man approached. Mid-40s, confident posture, expensive suit worn like armor. The kind of man who believed certainty alone was proof of belonging. He stopped at the table, glanced at the empty chairs, then at Hopkins. Without a word, he reached for the chair next to Hopkins' chair, and pulled it back. Hopkins was still sitting in it. The man paused, then smiled thinly. "Oh, sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "I thought this seat was open." "It isn't," Hopkins replied calmly. The man laughed. "Right. Of course." Then he did something worse than apologize poorly. He gestured at Hopkins. "Would you mind moving? I meant to be up here." A few people nearby turned their heads. This wasn't loud. This wasn't dramatic. It was casual disrespect, the kind delivered with confidence, assuming compliance would follow. Hopkins looked at the man for a moment. Not irritated. Not confused. Curious. "I don't mind," Hopkins said. "But I won't." The smile on the man's face faltered. "I'm sorry," he said. Hopkins repeated himself just as calmly. "I don't mind. But I won't move." The man chuckled again, louder this time, for the benefit of the small audience forming. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Hopkins nodded. "There has." The man leaned in slightly. "This table is for speakers." "Yes," Hopkins said. "It is." "And you're?" the man prompted. Hopkins met his eyes. "Seated." A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't going how it was supposed to go. The man had expected confusion, maybe embarrassment, followed by accommodation. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not delivered so evenly. "Well," the man said, straightening, "perhaps someone should clarify." Hopkins didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture, didn't perform authority. He simply stayed where he was. "I'm quite clear," he said. The man's jaw tightened. "You're holding up the event." Hopkins glanced around the table. No one else seemed concerned. "I don't believe I am," he said. At this point, a host approached quickly, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right?" she asked, smiling professionally. "Yes," Hopkins said. The man spoke at the same time. "There's been a mix-up. I'm supposed to be seated here." The host glanced at the name card in front of Hopkins. Then she froze just slightly. "Oh," she said. The man noticed the shift. "Yes. That seat," the host said carefully, "is reserved." "I know," the man replied impatiently. "That's why For Sir Anthony Hopkins," she finished. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Not cinematic. The kind that drops because no one knows what to do next. The man stared at the host. Then at Hopkins. Hopkins remained seated. Hands folded. Expression unchanged. The man laughed once sharply. "Right," he said. "Very funny." The host didn't smile. "It's not a joke," she said. The man's face flushed slightly. "I wasn't told." Hopkins spoke gently. "That's often how it happens." The line wasn't cruel. That was what made it devastating. The man straightened, glancing around, suddenly aware of how many people were watching now. "Well," he said, forcing confidence, "I'm sure we can rearrange." Hopkins shook his head once. "There's no need." The man swallowed. "I didn't mean any disrespect." Hopkins looked at him steadily. "Intent isn't required." Another beat of silence. The host gestured toward another seat further down the table. We can place you there. The man hesitated, just long enough to show that this was no longer about seating. It was about status. Finally, he nodded stiffly and moved away, shoulders tight. Hopkins watched him go. Not with satisfaction, not with judgment. Simply watching. Conversation resumed slowly, unevenly. Like a room finding its balance again. People leaned closer to one another. Voices dropped. Something had been corrected without spectacle. A woman seated nearby leaned toward Hopkins. You handled that very well, she said quietly. Hopkins smiled faintly. It didn't require handling. She studied him. Most people would have moved. Hopkins shrugged. Most people don't realize when they're being asked to disappear. The event continued. Speeches were given. Applause followed. Plates were cleared. Wine refilled. But the moment lingered. Not because Hopkins had asserted dominance. Because he hadn't. He hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't invoked his name. Hadn't demanded recognition. He had simply stayed where he belonged. Across the room, the man avoided eye contact. His earlier confidence replaced with restraint. He spoke less. Laughed carefully. The correction had landed. Not as humiliation, but as exposure. Hopkins remained present, listening, contributing when necessary, silent when not. He didn't look around to see who noticed. He didn't need to, because everyone had. And what none of them knew yet was that this small, quiet moment, this refusal to yield space, was about to travel far beyond the room. Not as gossip, as example. What followed would decide whether the lesson ended there, or whether the man who took a seat without asking would come to understand exactly what he had done wrong. The correction didn't echo with laughter. It settled. That was the difference. As the evening progressed, people spoke more carefully, not because they were afraid of Anthony Hopkins, but because the room had been reminded of something it usually forgot. Presence didn't need permission. The man who had tried to take the seat sat farther down the table now. He nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, but something had changed in the way he held himself. The confidence was still there, but thinner, more deliberate. As if he'd realized too late that confidence without awareness was fragile. Hopkins noticed, but he didn't watch. That wasn't his way. He listened as the first speaker took the stage, applauded politely, leaned back, hands resting lightly on the table. The event resumed its rhythm, but the earlier imbalance never fully returned. People had felt it, and once felt, it couldn't be unfelt. During a break between speeches, the man approached again, slower this time. No es mai. No entitlement. Just a cautious step into Hopkins' peripheral vision. Sir Anthony, he said quietly. Hopkins looked up. Yes. The man cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. Hopkins waited. I assumed, the man continued. And I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to be rude. Hopkins regarded him calmly. Not coldly. Calmly. Assumptions aren't personal, he said. They're habits. The man nodded, absorbing the distinction. I didn't recognize you at first, he added quickly, as if that explained something. Hopkins tilted his head slightly. That's fortunate. The man blinked. Fortunate. Yes, Hopkins said. It means the correction didn't require recognition to be valid. The man exhaled slowly. He wasn't being dismissed, but he wasn't being reassured either. I understand, he said. Hopkins nodded once. Good. That was the end of the conversation. No nectar. No forgiveness requested. No humiliation completed. Just clarity. The man walked away. Not angry, not embarrassed, but changed. He didn't try to reclaim ground. He didn't tell the story loudly. He kept it to himself, where lessons tend to last longer. As the evening wound down, a few guests approached Hopkins quietly. Not to praise him, but to acknowledge what they'd seen. That was instructive, one woman said. Hopkins smiled faintly. I wasn't teaching. You were, she replied. You just didn't announce it. Later, as coats were collected and goodbyes exchanged, the host thanked Hopkins again for attending. We're honored you joined us, she said sincerely. Hopkins nodded. Thank you for the seat. She smiled, understanding more than the words suggested. Outside, the night air was cool. Hopkins stepped away from the lights and noise unhurried. He wasn't replaying the moment. He rarely did. To him, it was already finished. But the others weren't finished with it. The story traveled. Not embellished, not dramatized. Didn't need to be. The power of it lay in its simplicity. A man assumed space. Another man declined to surrender it. No angit. No authority invoked. Just stillness. People told it quietly, usually prefaced with, "You know what I saw once?" It became a reference point. Not for fame but for behavior. In rooms where hierarchy was assumed, someone would hesitate before taking what wasn't offered. In conversations where entitlement crept in, someone would remember the cost of being corrected without cruelty. That was Hopkins' influence. Not intimidation. Not dominance. Precision. Years later, someone asked him why he didn't simply stand up and move. Why he chose to make it uncomfortable. Hopkins thought for a moment. "I didn't make it uncomfortable," he said. "The assumption did." That was the truth of it. Discomfort didn't come from refusal. It came from entitlement meeting reality. The man who took the seat learned that lesson in seconds. But the room learned something deeper. That dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't require acknowledgement to exist. Simply stays. Anthony Hopkins had not defended his seat. He had occupied it. And in doing so, he reminded everyone present that space, physical or otherwise, is not taken. It's given. And when it isn't given, the strongest response is not aggression. It's remaining exactly where you are. That was the end of it. No follow-up. No confrontación divisitive. Just a quiet moment that corrected an entire room, and then let everyone go on with their evening a little more aware than before. The effect lingered long after the chairs were pushed back and the room emptied. In the weeks that followed, people who had been there found themselves recalling the moment at unexpected times. Not as a story to tell loudly, but as a reference point, a quiet recalibration of how power actually worked when stripped of theatrics. One guest admitted later that he'd almost done the same thing at another event. Claimed a seat that looked available, assumed compliance without asking. He stopped himself mid-step, not out of fear but awareness. The memory of how swiftly and cleanly entitlement had been corrected stayed with him. That was how the lesson traveled. Not as gossip, as instinct. Anthony Hopkins never followed up. He didn't acknowledge the incident again. Even when the man later sent a polite note thanking him for his restraint, Hopkins replied with a single line. "I hope the evening was worthwhile." Nothing more. Nothing less. Because for Hopkins, the moment had never been about him. It had been about space, who feels entitled to it, and who is expected to surrender it quietly. By staying seated, by refusing to shrink or escalate, he'd exposed the assumption without humiliating the person who made it. That balance mattered. Humiliation hardens people. Clarity educates them. Those who'd witnessed it began to recognize the difference. They noticed how often politeness was used as a pressure tool, how frequently silence was mistaken for consent. And once you see that pattern, it's difficult to unsee. Months later, at a completely different gathering, someone joked about pulling a Hopkins before sitting down. Asking first, checking names, waiting to be invited. The phrase stuck briefly before fading back into private shorthand. That too was fitting. The most effective corrections rarely need branding. Hopkins continued as he always had, working, observing, occupying rooms without dominating them. He didn't cultivate the story. He didn't deny it either. He allowed it to exist exactly as it was, complete. When asked once, much later, about moments where he'd had to assert himself without confrontation, he answered simply. "You don't assert," he said. "You remain." That philosophy explained everything. Because remaining without apology, without aggression, is often the clearest statement a person can make. And that night, with nothing more than calm presence and a refusal to move, Anthony Hopkins had made one that lasted far longer than the moment itself.